All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most genuinely terrifying moments in all of modern history. We're talking about a time when the entire world just held its breath, staring right into the abyss of a full-blown nuclear war.
A movie made about the crisis years later used that as its tagline, and honestly, it just hits the nail on the head. For a few weeks there, in the fall of 1962, humanity was walking on a razor's edge. We were teetering between a really fragile peace and total, complete annihilation.
And the absolute most intense, white-knuckle part of this whole standoff, it boiled down to just this: 13 days. Think about that. Every single hour mattered. Every decision, every garbled message could have been the one that tipped the scales for good.
So yeah, that's what we're going to walk through. That incredibly tense 13-day political and military showdown in October 1962. A showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union that pushed the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before, or thankfully ever has been since.
So how on earth did we get to such a dangerous point? This didn't just happen overnight. To really understand the crisis, we have to rewind the clock just a little bit and look at the geopolitical pressure cooker that was just about ready to blow.
The whole world, for decades, was basically divided into two camps, right? Team USA and Team USSR. It was this constant, simmering rivalry for influence, for technology, for military might, always just below the surface of a direct shooting war, what they called a hot war.
And this is what lit the fuse. All of a sudden, the Cold War wasn't some abstract thing happening on the other side of the planet. For the United States, a Soviet-friendly communist nation was now right on its doorstep. A mere 90 miles south of Florida. That changed everything.
Now, what's so fascinating here is that if you look at it, both sides felt like they were acting in self-defense. From the U.S. perspective, it was simple. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba? That's a direct, unacceptable threat, period. But then, you flip it. From the Soviet perspective, the U.S. already had missiles aimed right at them in Turkey, right on their border. For their leader, Nikita Khrushchev, putting missiles in Cuba was just leveling the playing field. And it was a way to tell the U.S., hey, don't even think about trying to invade Cuba again, like they did with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion.
So, the stage is set. The tension is sky high. Now let's get to the moment it all blew up, the discovery that officially kicked off the crisis and the terrifying sequence of events that followed. It all started with these photos, taken by a high-altitude spy plane. On October 14th, the evidence was right there, undeniable. 2 days later, President Kennedy saw them, and he immediately pulled together the secret group of his top advisors called XCOM to figure out what in the world to do. And for almost a full week, they debated in total secrecy before Kennedy finally went on TV and revealed the crisis to a pretty stunned American public and, well, the entire world. Can you imagine being in those meetings? The military advisors were pushing for a full-scale invasion, or at least surgical airstrikes. But Kennedy, he chose a different path for the first step. He called it a naval quarantine, which is basically a blockade to stop any more Soviet ships from delivering missiles to Cuba. Don't let the word quarantine fool you. This was not a soft approach. Kennedy's TV address was an ultimatum. He looked the world in the eye and said flat out that the U.S. was prepared to use military force to get rid of this threat. After that speech, people everywhere genuinely thought this was it. This was how the world ends. And this is where things got unbelievably tense. Just 2 days after that speech, Soviet ships, loaded with more military gear, were steaming directly towards that American quarantine line. This was a global game of chicken, and the whole world was watching. That was the question on everyone's mind, right? If those Soviet ships try to run the blockade, the U.S. Navy has orders to stop them, maybe even fire on them. And that one moment, that one single confrontation, could have instantly spiraled into World War III. And then, a collective, global sigh of relief. The Soviet ships stopped, dead in the water, just before they reached the line. It was a massive de-escalation. But, and this is a huge but, it didn't solve the real problem. The nuclear missiles that were already in Cuba were still there, and they were still being prepped to launch. Listen to this. This quote from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, just perfectly captures the mood on October 27th, a day that became known as Black Saturday, because that was the day an American spy plane was actually shot down over Cuba. That's an act of war. The feeling in the halls of power, both in Washington and Moscow, was that nuclear war wasn't just possible anymore. It was practically inevitable. So, if both sides were getting ready for the absolute worst, how are we all still here? Well, the answer didn't come from military strength. It came from a really confusing, frantic, and in the end, kind of brilliant series of back-channel negotiations.
Okay, this part is pretty wild. The Kennedy team gets two totally different messages from Khrushchev. The first one is sort of public, and it's simple. We'll take our missiles out if you promise you'll never invade Cuba. Easy enough. But then, a second, much tougher message comes through, demanding the U.S. also remove its missiles from Turkey. So the Kennedy team came up with a brilliant solution. They decided to publicly accept the first offer and just pretend they never even got the second one. But privately, the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, gave a secret message to the Soviet ambassador saying, yeah, okay, we'll get the missiles out of Turkey later, but it absolutely cannot be part of the public deal.
And guess what? It worked. The Soviets agreed to the deal. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced over public radio that the missiles in Cuba were being dismantled. The 13-day standoff was over. The world could finally exhale.
The immediate danger had passed, which is great, but the crisis left this deep, permanent mark on the world. The leaders of both superpowers were genuinely shaken up by how close they had come to total catastrophe.
So in the aftermath, a few big things happened. First, to make sure they could actually talk to each other next time, a direct hotline was set up between the White House and the Kremlin. Second, everyone was so spooked that they actually signed some treaties to limit nuclear testing. But there was a third, kind of chilling legacy. The Soviets felt outgunned and humiliated, so they began a massive buildup of their own long-range missiles, determined to never be in that weak a position again. And that escalated the arms race to a terrifying new level.
And that's what we're left with, this really tough question. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often held up as this moment where brilliant diplomacy saved humanity. And it did. But you have to wonder, did it really teach the world a lesson about how insane it is to play chicken with nuclear weapons? Or did it just convince the superpowers that the only way to stay safe was to build an even bigger, scarier arsenal?